the face in the crowd changed everything. Jimmy Fallon stood frozen behind his desk, his trademark smile vanishing as he watched Oprah Winfrey stop mid-sentence, her eyes locked on someone in the studio audience. For a moment that felt like eternity, the Tonight Show's usually electric atmosphere turned electric in a completely different way. What happened next would remind everyone watching why television, at its best, isn't just entertainment, it's human connection at its most powerful. It had started like any other Tuesday night taping. Jimmy bounced onto the stage with his usual energy, tie perfectly knotted, cards shuffled and ready. The audience was buzzing with excitement. Oprah Winfrey was the guest, and everyone knew that meant something special was about to happen. But as Jimmy would learn in the next few minutes, sometimes the most special moments are the ones nobody plans for. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the one and only Oprah Winfrey. Jimmy's voice carried that perfect blend of reverence and excitement that only comes when you're introducing someone who needs no introduction. The audience erupted. Oprah glided across the stage in a flowing emerald dress, radiating that unmistakable presence that has captivated audiences for decades. They settled into the familiar rhythm of late-night television. Jimmy asked about her latest projects, Oprah shared stories about her book club, and the audience laughed at all the right moments. The conversation flowed like water, natural, warm, engaging. Jimmy loosened his tie slightly, leaning back in his chair as Oprah began telling a story about a recent trip to her school in South Africa. "You know, Jimmy," Oprah was saying, her voice taking on that tone that signals something meaningful is coming. "I was walking through the classrooms, and I saw this young girl. She couldn't have been more than 12 years old. And then it happened." Jimmy stopped mid-nod. Oprah's words trailed off into silence. The entire studio froze. Oprah's eyes had found something, or someone, in the audience that made her forget where she was, what she was saying, even that millions of people were watching. Her hand moved instinctively to her chest, and for the first time in her legendary career, Oprah Winfrey was speechless. Jimmy followed her gaze into the audience, scanning the faces until he saw what had captured her attention. In the third row, partially hidden behind a couple in matching Tonight Show t-shirts, sat an elderly black woman. She looked to be in her 80s, wearing a simple purple cardigan and clutching a worn leather purse. Her eyes were locked on Oprah with an expression Jimmy had never seen before, a mixture of recognition, love, and something that looked almost like disbelief. The woman's lips moved silently, forming a single word that Jimmy couldn't hear but somehow understood. "Oprah." For what felt like an hour but was probably only seconds, nobody moved. The cameras kept rolling, catching every nuance of this unscripted moment. Jimmy could feel his production team in his earpiece, probably panicking about the dead air, but something told him to wait. This wasn't a moment to interrupt. Then Oprah did something that would be replayed on social media for weeks. She stood up from her chair, stepped off the stage, and walked directly into the audience. The woman in purple half rose from her seat, tears streaming down her cheeks. When Oprah reached her, they embraced like long-lost family members, and suddenly the entire studio understood they were witnessing something sacred. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Jimmy watched from his desk, his usual quick wit replaced by something deeper. He could see the tears in Oprah's eyes, could feel the emotion radiating from both women. The studio audience sat in complete silence, sensing that this was bigger than entertainment. When Oprah finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. "Everyone, I want you to meet Mrs. Dorothy Williams." She helped the elderly woman to her feet, keeping a protective arm around her shoulders. 60 years ago, when I was just a scared little girl in Milwaukee, Mrs. Williams was my third-grade teacher. She was the first person who ever told me I was smart. The first person who ever made me believe I could be anything I wanted to be. The audience drew a collective breath. Jimmy felt something tighten in his chest. This was television magic, the kind that doesn't happen in rehearsals or focus groups. Mrs. Williams, now steadied by Oprah's presence, found her voice. It was soft but clear, carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades shaping young minds. I always knew you were going to change the world, Oprah. I just never imagined. Her voice broke. I never imagined I'd live to see how right I was. Behind the scenes, Jimmy made a decision that defied every producer's expectation. He stepped out from behind his desk, leaving his cards, his notes, his carefully planned questions behind. This wasn't about the show anymore. This was about something more important. Mrs. Williams, Jimmy said, his voice gentler than anyone had ever heard it on television. Would you like to come up here and sit with us? The question hung in the air for a moment before Mrs. Williams nodded, tears still flowing freely. Oprah helped her navigate the steps to the stage, and Jimmy personally arranged a chair between his desk and Oprah's guest seat. As Mrs. Williams settled into her unexpected place of honor, Jimmy did something else that surprised everyone, including himself. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a pen, not just any pen, but the one his own third-grade teacher, Mrs. Peterson, had given him when he told her he wanted to be on television someday. He'd carried it with him to every important moment of his career. Without a word, he placed it in Mrs. Williams' hands. Every great story starts with a teacher who believes, he said simply. This is for you. The gesture was small, but its impact was seismic. Mrs. Williams looked down at the pen, then up at Jimmy, then over at Oprah, as if trying to process how a simple Tuesday evening had transformed into this moment of recognition and honor. Oprah reached over and took Mrs. Williams' free hand. Tell them what you used to say to me every morning, Mrs. Williams. Tell them what you wrote on my report card that my grandmother framed and hung in our kitchen. Mrs. Williams smiled through her tears, and suddenly she wasn't an elderly woman in a television studio. She was every teacher who had ever seen potential in a struggling child. I wrote, she began, her voice growing stronger. This child has a light inside her that could illuminate the world. It is our job to make sure that light never dims. She paused, looking directly into one of the cameras. And I said that to every child who walked through my classroom door, because every single one of them had that same light. The studio erupted. Not in the orchestrated applause of a television taping, but in the spontaneous, emotional response of people who had just witnessed something authentic and beautiful. Jimmy found himself applauding too, his eyes wet with tears he didn't try to hide. But this is the moment no one in the studio, and no one watching at home, ever saw coming. As the applause died down, Mrs. Williams turned to the camera and spoke directly to the audience. If you're watching this, she said, and you're a teacher, or you work with children, or you're raising children, remember this, you never know which child you're talking to might grow up to change the world. Love them all like they already have. The words hit Jimmy like a physical force. He thought about his own children, about the teachers who had shaped him, about the responsibility every adult has to nurture the potential in every young person they encounter. Oprah was crying openly now, not the composed tears of a media professional, but the raw emotion of someone reliving a pivotal moment from their childhood. Mrs. Williams, she said, I need you to know something. Every scholarship I've given, every school I've built, every time I've told a young person they matter. That all started in your classroom. You didn't just teach me to read and write. You taught me to believe in myself. Mrs. Williams reached over and patted Oprah's hand with the gentle authority of a teacher comforting a student. You were always going to find your way, honey. I just helped you see the path a little clearer. Jimmy knew this was television history in the making, but more than that, he knew he was witnessing something that transcended entertainment. This was about legacy, about the ripple effects of kindness, about how a single teacher's belief in a child could eventually touch millions of lives. As the segment wound down, Jimmy made one more decision that would define this moment forever. Instead of going to commercial break, instead of moving on to the next planned segment, he asked everyone in the studio, audience, crew, band members, to stand and give Mrs. Williams a sustained ovation. For 2 full minutes, The Tonight Show became a celebration of teaching, of believing in children, of the power one person can have to change another person's life. Mrs. Williams stood between Jimmy and Oprah, holding that pen like a torch, smiling through tears that seemed to contain 60 years of pride and validation. When the cameras finally stopped rolling, something had fundamentally changed. Jimmy walked Mrs. Williams backstage personally, making sure she was comfortable, ensuring his team would take care of getting her home safely. But before she left, she had one more surprise. From her worn leather purse, she pulled out a small, yellowed piece of paper, Oprah's original report card from 1963. She'd carried it with her to the taping, hoping for just a chance to say hello. Instead, she'd been given a platform to remind the world of every teacher's sacred responsibility. Share this story and subscribe. Make sure this moment is never forgotten. In the days that followed, the video went viral in the way that only truly authentic moments can. Teachers across the country shared it with their colleagues. Parents showed it to their children. The Oprah Mrs. Williams reunion became a symbol of something larger: the power of education, the importance of believing in potential, the way kindness compounds across decades. Jimmy's pen became a symbol too. Mrs. Williams kept it for exactly 1 week before donating it to the Smithsonian's National Museum of Education, along with Oprah's original report card, as part of an exhibit on the power of teachers to change lives. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of that night was what happened to Jimmy himself. That Tuesday evening reminded him why he'd fallen in love with television in the first place, not for the fame or the platform, but for the ability to create moments of genuine human connection. From that night forward, Jimmy approached his show differently, always looking for opportunities to celebrate the people who shape our world in quiet, powerful ways. The Tonight Show had always been about entertainment, but that night, it became something more. It became a reminder that behind every success story is someone who believed first, loved unconditionally, and saw potential where others saw problems. Mrs. Williams lived to be 94, passing away peacefully in her sleep 5 years after that magical night. At her funeral, Oprah delivered the eulogy, and Jimmy sent flowers with a note that read simply, "Thank you for teaching me what really matters." But the story doesn't end there. 6 months after that unforgettable night, Jimmy received a letter that would further cement the impact of what had happened. It was from a young teacher in Detroit named Maria Rodriguez, who had been struggling with burnout after 3 challenging years in an underfunded school. "Dear Mr. Fallon," the letter began, "I was ready to quit teaching. I watched your show that night with Mrs. Williams and cried for an hour. Then I went to school the next day and saw my students differently. I started telling each one of them that they had a light inside them. 3 of my students who were failing are now honor roll students. One told me last week that I was the first teacher who ever believed in him. I'm not quitting anymore. Thank you for reminding me why I became a teacher." Jimmy read that letter on air during his monologue, his voice breaking as he shared Maria's words. "This is what Mrs. Williams was talking about," he said to the camera. "This is how one teacher's belief becomes a wave that touches lives she'll never even meet." The response was overwhelming. Teachers from across the country began sharing their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of breakthrough with students they almost gave up on. #TeachersLight became a hashtag that trended for weeks, with educators sharing photos of thank you notes from former students, graduation announcements, and simple moments of connection that reminded them why their work mattered. Mrs. Williams, watching from her living room in Milwaukee, became an inadvertent celebrity. Schools invited her to speak. Teachers' colleges asked her to share her wisdom with new educators. But she always gave the same simple advice. See the potential, not the problem. Love them first, teach them second. And never, ever give up on a child, because you don't know which one will grow up to change the world. Jimmy started a scholarship fund in Mrs. Williams' name for aspiring teachers, and every year on the anniversary of that magical Tuesday night, he dedicated a segment to celebrating educators. The Tonight Show stage became a place where teachers were honored not just for their academic achievements, but for their faith in human potential. The pen they shared that night serves as an eternal reminder that the most powerful force in the world isn't fame, or fortune, or influence. It's a teacher who sees the light in a child and refuses to let it dim. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, that light grows bright enough to illuminate the whole world.